And I love that this was almost set up as like a way for Alasdair Gray to explore these questions and to find at the core of them like what might be some faults in them, and she starts poking at them and saying, oh, what about this thing, and like a lot of that stuff I think is kind of the heart of the book, and at the time I didn't realize it, how important it was to the message of the book, but I think it is sort of essential. Welcome, friends, to episode 301 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Alasdair Gray's 1992 novel, Poor Things. So what a weird book we just read.
What an absolute journey we just went on.
Weird, sort of gothic.
I went through a lot with this book. I started it out and I was like, what the hell are we reading? I had no idea. I hadn't looked at any of the materials really. I didn't know what the story was about. I've seen like one trailer for the film and I'd heard good things, but then I was like, what a bizarre story. And I like, as it kind of grew on me as it went on, and it actually, I find to be like really fascinating and well crafted, but like, holy shit, just the premises right off the bat, crazy.
Yeah, it's a wild one, man. Incredibly unique book. Although heavily drawing on some inspirations, and some of which we've talked about with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Totally.
I think it became clear to me pretty early that this was heavily drawing on that, and some other books too that I've heard talked about, but I'm not as familiar with. That's the one that's like my touchstone. But yeah, I mean, this is a really fascinating book, and then like looking up more stuff about the author, he's a really interesting guy. Huge connection to Glasgow and Scotland. Which was a bit delightful for me to read about because I'm going to Glasgow for Worldcon this year.
Yeah.
So pretty rad that I'll be able to maybe look around at some of these places described. He has murals all over the city that are like prominent places you can go look at because he's an accomplished painter and artist, maybe even equally as famous for that as he is his writing.
Wow.
Just pretty rad.
I mean, Glasgow was such a big part of the story. Like I was surprised at how much it kept coming back to that. And unfortunately, I don't know the history, as I feel like there was some stuff that I was missing because I'm not super familiar with like the political, because there was clearly a lot of like political stuff that was some commentary being made here.
Absolutely. This is a highly political book. And I found a really funny quote from him, which I assume is being delivered sort of tongue in cheek, but also kind of serious. My stories try to seduce the reader by disguising themselves as sensational entertainment, but are propaganda for democratic welfare state socialism and the independent Scottish Parliament. My jacket designs and illustrations, especially the erotic ones, are designed with the same high purpose.
Interesting. Like that.
So you definitely got a sense as you're reading it, it's like, this is, the political conversations that are going down. Like a lot of this book is about that. And I think just a lot of his body of work is about that as he's exploring different facets of it. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. What was your just general reaction to reading this book? Like you said, it kind of grew on you a little bit, but like by the end, how'd you feel about it?
Yeah, I'll say I started out detested by the book. And as it went on, I realized that was intentional. But
what do you mean detested by the book? Like you just really didn't like it?
I really didn't like where we were going with the story. It seemed like the male characters had so much like control over Bella, this Bella character, and then the way that it comes about and the way that she's infantilized because she is basically a child, and just the story premise from the get-go. Yeah. I was like, is this just what it is? It's like a woman, Frankenstein, that's going to, I don't think it's a spoiler because it happened so early. She's kind of created to service a specific character, and like in reading the entire novel, it there's a purpose to it, but early on I was like, oh, this is kind of gross. When was this written? And I think it's cool because it's specifically written in like the 90s, and then there's parts that take place in the 70s, but then it goes all the way back to like Victorian era, and it's kind of like poking fun at some of the social norms of the time and pushing back in certain ways. And I felt it to be like pretty transgressive in those ways, like paving new ground, maybe, I don't know, for the 90s, but it definitely felt like sort of in conversation with Frankenstein, taking a few steps further from what Frankenstein set up in terms of having that social commentary, and like kind of reflecting that stuff to our modern sensibilities, and it holds, some of the stuff is pretty wild because, just in terms of like autonomy, like body autonomy and like having full agency in stories, and some of those things are like still things that we talk about often in storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's I listened to a little bit of an interview he gave, and he talked a little bit about this, and he was mentioning like the Bride of Frankenstein, some different movies that he was reacting to in addition to Frankenstein itself, and you can totally see that here, right? Yeah, it was just in generalities for me, saying a similar kind of thing where I was like, I had my sort of defenses up. I'm reading this, and we often look at like older books. And I didn't know when this was written. I had to look it up. That it was in the 90s.
Same,
I thought maybe it was like a 70s book, or you know what I mean, because that's where the framing sort of device is. And I was like, how is this going to treat all this stuff? Because this is some really touchy material. And even still, like, I think it's a very delicate sort of set of material to talk about. It's potentially really triggering for people.
Well, and I think it's highly interpretive too. Like I can see people reading this and still walking away not liking it, just based on premise and some of the things that go on. But...
And he's sort of a surrealist author, right? And he's I think it is designed to be that. And there's all these layers, which I appreciate, but they have like a pros and cons to them, right? So he creates all these narrative layers. And this was the main thing that started reminding me of Frankenstein.
Yeah.
Because when we covered that book, it's like, yeah, it's told from the perspective of the monster to an extent, but it's told through like a letter from the monster that the other character's reciting to another character on a boat in the future. And like, so there's all these layers that get introduced.
When we covered that, that was one of the things we liked, the structure of it, the way that it was playing with the form.
And I feel like Mary Shelley was like treating a lot of it as sort of like, well, this is being truthfully told. It wasn't as much about like unreliable narrators. Whereas there's definitely a heavy element of like, is any of this true?
At the end, I would argue that I still am kind of, it's highly interpretive. Like I said, like you can kind of draw your own conclusions, and it's meant to be all of the things at the same time based on your perspective on it.
Well, and like how much is our main character here, McCandless, lying and casting himself in different lights, and we get sort of at the end we get a counter argument that we can talk about. So I guess before we move, because there's a lot of spoilery ways to talk about this that we're dancing around that I don't want to get into yet. So before we get into that, would you recommend this book to people who are curious about it after seeing the movie?
Oh yeah, I mean, I definitely would. I think the things that we've described in terms of how he's playing with structure, there's a lot of like social commentary going on, and I think some empowerment that I wasn't expecting early in the novel, maybe like sex positivity and some other things like that we'll definitely dig into.
Yeah, I agree. The politics of it actually were pretty refreshing for even a 90s book to be sort of radical socially and politically, far to the left, I would say. And it was fun to see those ideas portrayed in a Victorian light, to see them being like trotted out, and like how much pushback there is against any of those ideas at the time, right?
Yeah.
And how radical Baxter seems, because he kind of, fosters them, at least in Bella, and then Bella, of course, latches onto them eventually, and how much pushback she gets.
Yeah, so I think I would recommend it to people who are interested, with the caveat, like, especially if you've seen the film, you kind of understand what the premise is.
Probably, yeah. I mean, we haven't seen it yet. Full disclosure.
I think you have to follow through with the all of the strings and the threads that are being set up to really get the messaging of the story all the way through, because even up, like, I kind of thought the story was about to end, and then looking at my book, there are plenty of pages left.
Yeah.
And then we get this whole extra layer, like you talked about these layers, and I think it's fascinating. I think from a craft perspective, it's really creative and something to check out.
It's one of those books that like isn't designed with the ease of reading anywhere near the forefront of this book. It's not as difficult as that might make it sound. In fact, once you get into like the narrative proper, it's actually pretty easy to follow. Yeah. But it is definitely written in a certain style, and it's got all of these layers and framing devices and all this like extra errata that is included in the book surrounding the narrative that complicates things and can be a bit off-putting. That's like when I was talking about the pros and cons, like there is a con to that, in that a lot of people will encounter this stuff and go like, what is this? I just wanted to read a book. This is weird. I'm going to stop. You know what I mean? Like,
well,
but
and to
I
those
think
people,
I would recommend persisting, because I think there is a lot of value here. And again, I'm going to talk about this author and how important he is to Scottish literature. So if anything, if you're interested in that, he's definitely worth checking out.
and to the people that maybe get a little bogged down by the structure of it and everything, I would also say I find it to be really funny. Like absurdist humor is something that speaks to me. And I there were many times that like just the way that people are interacting and the way that the situations that characters are put in and the way that it's going against norms in really funny ways. That definitely kept me invested in times where I felt like there's a lot of dates and sort of like excerpts from newspapers and things like that being thrown at you.
I would still recommend it for people, with the caveat that it is a very much a Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with like a modern twist on it, but with a very heavy literary influence and sort of focus. It's trying to be different. It's trying to be boundary pushing, and that won't be for everybody, and it might not be for you, but I think it's worth giving it a try.
And for the record, by the end, I actually really enjoyed the novel. I thought it was definitely worth the read.
Yeah, agreed. I also ended up liking it. I don't know if I would say that I loved it, but it's also one of those tricky ones because it's like the thing that's there, the meat of it, that's really good, is really good and really unique. And so that pushes it into this like great art territory, even as my reaction to it wasn't as like overwhelmingly positive, because that's more like a taste surrounding the kinds of things I enjoy reading, and how I was encountering some difficulty with all of this errata and all of this framing that was keeping me at a distance. But once I could like rationalize and step back and like look at it sort of intellectually, I found more appreciation for it. But that's a different way of reading than I think a lot of people are used to. Take that for what it's worth. So let's talk about Alasdair Gray. He was born in 1934 and died in 2019, so only a few years ago. R.I.P. He was a Scottish writer and artist. His first novel, Lanark, published in 1981, is seen as a landmark of Scottish fiction. He published novels, short stories, plays, poetry, and translations, and wrote on politics and the history of English and Scots literature. His works of fiction combined realism, fantasy, and science fiction, with his own use of typography and illustrations, for which he won several awards. He is this legend in Glasgow, honestly. And I was watching an interview with a museum there. It was talking about how he wanted to capture life in Glasgow, and how like he was comparing it to all these other major cities like London and New York City. And he was saying like when people go there, you recognize everything you've seen in art and it feels familiar to you. We had this experience when we went to New York City recently. At least I did. It was like, yeah, I feel like I kind of know the city. Obviously it's through the entertainment lens, but like there's some familiarity there. And he was pointing out how there just wasn't anything in Glasgow. Like it's just a seldom used location. A lot of people don't have any experience with it, and he wanted to change that. So a lot of his art depicts Glasgow in particular. A lot of his novels are set there, and he became sort of known as like a beloved figure in that artistic scene. And his murals there's several of them all over the city. I was reading about one of them is in the Oran Moor, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong because there's accents on some of the letters.
Yeah,
I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. It's a venue in which he has this like ceiling mural that I've seen some images of, and I'm putting that on my list as like places I want to go. There's another one that's in the subway, like a mural along the subway. When you're coming out of it, it's a very distinct style, and once you sort of recognize it, I think it'll be easier to spot for me. His postmodern writing has been compared to that of Franz Kafka, George Orwell, and Borges. It often contains extensive footnotes explaining the works that influenced it, and his books went on to inspire many younger Scottish writers, including Irvine Welsh, Alan Warner, A.L. Kennedy, Janice Galloway, Chris Kelso, and Ian Banks. The name that jumped out at me from there was the Irvine Welsh, who we just covered for Trainspotting, famous Scottish author. So I thought that was cool to see that connection, that this is one of his influences. So Poor Things itself, he wrote later on in his career, 1992, right? But when it came out, it won the Whitbread Award and the Guardian Fiction Prize the same year. It was well regarded for its time. But again, it's not seen as his best. That's that Lanark novel. But it'll be curious to see how that might change with the popularity and success of Poor Things. Because I have a feeling that a lot more people are going to start associating this book with him than Lanark.
Yeah.
I don't know much about Lanark. I just know that it's said to be his that's his main work, among others. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. He also popularized this phrase, and I don't know if you've ever heard this, but I heard this just a few years ago, and I really liked it. And I don't think he came up with it, but he popularized it because he would put it in a bunch of his books. He'd have characters bring it up. Work as if you live in the early days of a better nation. I think that was his sort of motto in life, it seems like to me. He was someone who championed these ideals, and he saw that they're not taking off right now, but I'm going to sort of act as if these are the early days of one day we're going to look back and say there were people who were fighting for this, and this is the way that it ended up being a better nation. So I like that, and I think that that's something that a lot of people struggle with, right? Is you feel hopeless, but if you look at it that way and you cast it that way, it can kind of help with that feeling.
Yeah, I mean, so many problems feel larger than their era, and then we look back at certain things and we're like, why didn't they just do this differently? And yeah, to reframe it in that way and think well, if we're in those days now, we can kind of self-assess as if we're seeing it ourselves from the future and say what can we do differently now to push us into the direction we want to be down the line. So that's cool.
So this became a Scottish slogan that represented opposition to Thatcherism, which is something we've talked a little bit about, I believe, in the past with Alan Moore. I know that maybe it was Moorcock. We are outsiders looking at it, but I know that there is sort of the Margaret Thatcher era in Britain, and a lot of the pushback and push for Scottish independence, which is something we also read the Irvine Welsh champions, and that was something definitely that Alasdair Gray was championing as well. He wanted to establish Scotland as an independent nation. Again, outsiders here. Seems like a good thing. Seems like pushing back on colonialism and trying to establish independence. I do not know all the ins and outs and finer points of these politics.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to you hear about the stuff with the Irish and England, and you hear about all of that went on. So I assume, yeah, we would want these nations to hold independence, but again, we should probably be more well-read on that subject.
So he talked about how as a kid he spent a lot of time in one of the Glasgow museums where he would walk among the displays and exhibits, and that would sort of set his imagination working overtime, right? And he was also heavily inspired because he talked a lot about how as an artist he was dismissed, and his style is unusual, and a lot of people would say things like, well, you clearly spent a lot of time on this. That would be the compliment they would give him, and he'd be like, well, that was clear that they just didn't enjoy it or understand it.
Yeah.
But one of the main inspirations he found for his art was he was reading books where the author themselves did art for it. I think he even mentioned Tolkien. And you have Alice in Wonderland, and you have although I'm not sure if that's the author themselves, but regardless, there's all these different children's books that he would read, and other books where the artist would do, or the author would provide art, and the art itself was not the main purpose, and it was just kind of he called it okay. It's he didn't call it okay, but I'm summing up, it was just okay. And that made it more approachable to him, and the fact that it was it didn't have to be this amazing thing that you would see in a museum. He was oh, okay, I can do that. That's not too hard. And so that kind of kicked off his style as being what it is, I guess. I don't know. I'm not an art critic, so it's hard for me to describe it in a way that is probably accurate. But it's not going for realism.
Sure.
It's instead highly interpretive.
And there's something about that I feel evokes pure art. I think of, because I grew up listening to a lot of it, like punk rock is garage. It's not about how great it sounds and stuff as much some of the time as it's about the energy behind it. And so in that capacity, maybe the author is an author first and a an artist after that, but to get the art from the mind of the person who created it, I think gives some authenticity there and some level of intention. It's it doesn't necessarily have to be the best, especially when it can just sort of put a frame of reference in your mind, and then you can kind of roll with it from there.
Totally agree. I think that was his goal, right? He realized that he wasn't going to be able to do the other stuff, so this is what he wanted to do. And now he's world famous, and he's especially famous in Glasgow, right? I got a good taste for this art because I got the ebook for this one, and I also had the audiobook because it helps me stay focused. So I would often be listening to the audiobook while reading the ebook, right?
Yeah.
And there was some differences which you encounter from time to time when you're doing that, where things are just phrased slightly differently or something has been changed for the sort of audiobook adaptation of it. But it was mostly the same. But what it did add was also a lot of this art, which he had drawn himself.
Yeah.
And especially character portraits. It was really cool. And it definitely added something to it. There's all these little illustrations, like anatomical illustrations and all kinds of things like that between all the chapters. Well,
cool. And because the sexual nature of the book too, like there were a few that were like sex organs, and you're like, there's something very like in your face about that, like stylistic. It's not something you're expecting to see necessarily. And then just like other anatomy, like these people, there's a lot of like talk of surgeons and doctors and that kind of thing. So we're seeing like diagrams of hearts and spines, and usually they would be around the beginning or ends of chapters and kind of in some way represent something that possibly happened in the chapters, which I thought was cool.
Very cool. And then a couple times we got like there would be a letter written from like Bella, for example, and we'd see pages from it and like her handwriting and stuff, and like that was always cool because it would demonstrate a state of mind, and
that was super cool like when that happened. And like kind of in the middle of the book there's like 5 or 6 pages of just like scrawling. And we can talk about like what that maybe meant, but it was cool to see. That's a cool thing to see in a book, because that's not easy, and it's not like it's that cost effective. It's easier to print just words on it rather than print art like that.
All right, so I think I'm going to read a little bit of plot here, and we can talk about the book proper. I do love that he sort of presents himself as the editor of this book.
Oh yeah,
really it's part of the fiction of it. Like this is just something that like somebody else found, and he is now having the moment to curate as the editor of it, rather than the author of it. He says the author of it is McCandless.
Yeah. And so like there's some, let's talk about like some of that, because there's some liberties taken and some fictionalizing, because it's like there's clearly the Alasdair that's in our world.
Yeah.
And then there's the fictionalized version who's the editor. And then there's the person who found the book in the first place.
Well, that's the funny thing is he mentions like 2 people that are like his friends that he's had lots of debates with about the nature of this book, and one sees it as very comic, and the other one's, you know what I mean? And those people are also real. Right, like his real life friends.
Oh wow, cool.
He like wrote into the book as well, and like obviously discussing this fictional narrative. And like there's like an element of this where I think it's supposed to be taken as like a you don't know, right? As like a little bit, it creates that little bit of doubt, I think, for some readers who are going to say like, maybe this is a real thing that somebody found.
Well, and it has ramifications at the end of the book too. Like at first you don't really know why it matters that he's involved in the book as well. But as we come to realize, there's like unreliable narrators across the board, and even he within the fiction of the story as the editor could be fudging things, and because he clearly says he changes the chapter titles in some cases.
Yeah.
That's maybe not the only thing he's changing. It's a game of telephone, right? We're getting so many different versions, and you're left to interpret kind of what you think is the true story or meaning.
Yeah, it creates a very interesting effect. So let's talk about the main body of the text, though, and that's what this plot's gonna at least at first focus on. The main body of the work centers on Bella Baxter, a woman whose early life and identity are subject of some ambiguity. That ambiguity is complicated by her husband Archibald McCandless's autobiography, Episodes from the Early Life of a Scottish Public Health Officer, which distorts the truth about his life with Bella. He claims that she was a corpse, resurrected by McCandless's colleague, the scientist Dr. Godwin Baxter, who had her brain swapped with that of her unborn fetus, resulting in her having an infant's mind. While designed to be Baxter's companion, her sexual appetite causes her to pursue other men, including McCandless and a foppish lawyer named Duncan Wedderburn, with whom she elopes and embarks on a hedonistic odyssey around Europe, Northern Africa, and Central Asia. So that's how it sums up the plot of the book here, and I think that's a good at least jumping off point, and then we can talk about what happens from that. But yeah, we got to just talk about the sort of bomb that just got dropped there.
Yeah.
The setup, the idea that she was a pregnant woman who drowned, and then this Frankenstein's Victor Frankenstein, you might argue. Although it's also heavily implied that he himself might be some sort of surgical creation. He's very oddly shaped. His hands are very strange. They look like they're out of proportion. He has a lot of these like digestive tract issues. He's like drinking vegetable juice and stuff throughout. And his father was this like famous surgeon, so maybe his father's actually the Victor Frankenstein. Is he himself then like a Frankenstein's monster who is now creating the Bride of Frankenstein? You could kind of read it that way. Right. But at the very least, Godwin Baxter is a very accomplished surgeon who is doing things that, of course, are like way beyond science of the time and even today. But he is able to take the brain of this like 9-month-old fetus and implant it into her skull. And then she is sort of reborn as this adult woman with the brain of an infant. And she's in this like attractive body. And you can immediately see why me and James were both like, uh-oh, where's this gonna go? Because that's immediately getting to some really weird territory, because she's also like sexual and like she keeps coming on to people even as she has the brain of an infant.
And just that being written by a man, like that character being written by a man, I'm like, oh boy, here we go. I mean, it's also notable that I think at some point we learned from Baxter's perspective that she wasn't actually dead. She was like brought as if she had died, right? She possibly drowned, but before he like resuscitated her or dead, something.
But they were able to save the body, but the brain had died, I think.
Okay. I think this is the first like instance of something that I was feeling was some of the commentary here is like body autonomy, men deciding what's going to happen to a woman's body. She not just died and drowned, she tried to kill herself. Yeah. So she jumped off a bridge or something and tried to kill herself.
We find out later why she did. Yeah.
This guy says, you know what, I'm going to create a companion in quotes for myself. And he's like talking about how like, you know, women are attracted to him and all this other disgusting stuff leading up to the reveal that this person's been brought back.
Well, admittedly, a lot of that gets thrown into question later on. Some of this might be McCandless, because this is all told from McCandless's point of view. Right. He's this other doctor who has met Baxter. As like they're like medical students together, and he's like, this guy's really brilliant, but he's very strange, he's very off-putting, and then he's done this thing, and like he interprets that as he wants to make this like sexual companion for himself, right? And she's not attracted to him because she views him more as like a father figure or God, which it was funny how she shortens his name to God and just refers to him as God.
So funny. She eventually ends up in scenarios where like philosophy is being discussed and debated. And then it's so funny when people will ask her about it and she's like, well, I know my God. And then she's talking about Godwin, the person who like created her. But to get back to the whole body autonomy thing, like she made a decision and then someone else took that out of her hands, brought her back, and then was going to force her to basically be like a sexual object, sexual companion. And then we get into the fact
we should say like he wasn't going to like force her, but that was kind of his hope. But it seems like he was intending to just raise her. And then he hoped that it would develop into she would become a romantic partner for him, according to McCandless.
Yeah. Again, that's all still terrible to raise something and then want it to be sexually
and this is what you're talking about, that like transgressive, like, oh my God, like almost seedy, like just to imagine it. It's like, oh my God. And like it definitely sets you, like, as soon as you get to this part, like that's where I was like hooked, you know. It's like human nature, right? You're like, how dare he write this?
And that's something that, you know, getting into that territory of like taboos and things that like exploring that space in a way that has substance and has a message to it. I think eventually throughout the story, it plays out. But early on, we're reacting to how we were in the moment. And so then you consider, all right, this is an infant, like a baby in a body of a grown woman. And then the way that there's sexual interactions happening very soon. And they kind of
very early
explain that like, oh, it's part of the chemical makeup of you know, the human body at that age. And then she's like hasn't been burdened with sort of the social norms and all this other stuff. But regardless, they are wanting that. It seems like all the men right away are pursuing that and kind of trying to...
Every man that interacts with her is immediately in love with her and like wants her to marry him, and like it happens over and over again.
And McCandless knows from Baxter kind of where she is mentally, and he's like, yeah, let's get married and all this other stuff when she's effectively like not even a year old, or maybe, I don't know. They explain that like her, because of her body's age, it allows like development faster as far as the brain's concerned. But
that's the explanation we're given, is that her mind is like accelerating through development because she's in an older body. It's like trying to catch up. and it's demonstrated, her like mental age is demonstrated by the friends she has and like how she feels about them.
Yeah.
And the first time McCandless meets her, she has like a toddler who's a friend, so it's like clearly that's kind of her mental age. And then like later on, you start to see it kind of sort of progress, and she's like friends with older kids, but even then starts sort of rapidly outpacing them. One of the reasons why this made me worried is there is this trope, and it first came to my attention as a thing by the YouTube channel Pop Culture Detective, which I'm sure you've seen some of his stuff.
Yep.
He does great breakdowns where he talks about these tropes, and one of my favorite videos he has is called Born Sexy Yesterday. I think that's the name of it. And it talks about the trope of the like childlike woman who's in an adult like sexual woman's body, and how this is a disturbing fantasy that plays out time and time again across media. You'd be surprised to see how often it seems to come up. And so being aware of that trope, when I'm reading this is like the embodiment of that.
Yeah.
So I was immediately worried, but I'm glad to say that I think Alasdair Gray was sort of aware of what he was doing here. And so a lot of what plays out interrogates that in a sense. Now, whether or not it's perfect, I think that is far beyond me to say. But it is dealt with not as someone who is like bungled into this trope, right?
Yeah.
And it's more like he's doing this very deliberately to provoke certain reaction, and then to analyze how the men treat her, and to analyze like how she responds to that as she starts to have this burgeoning self-awareness and maturity, and how she starts to immediately identify how she's been used and how she's been perceived by people, and how that makes us feel about them, and makes us feel, it makes me feel about McCandless, or makes me feel about Wedderburn, and even Baxter himself.
Her development is happening very quickly. She decides to marry McCandless. That's like a very early decision that I would argue she was too young to make. But then
they get engaged.
Sorry, yeah.
And she's like, all right, see you soon.
Yeah.
And then when he comes back the next time, she's like, oh, and now I'm actually running off with this other guy who I met. And then immediately, she has like a time distortion problem where like it's only been like 6 days, but she perceives it as years. And she's like, oh, we talked but it's been such a long time since we've spoken again. I almost forgot about it. And then, this Wedderburn guy who seems pretty awful, just immediately, again, every guy who interacts with her is immediately taken by this woman who has the brain of a child. So yeah, you can see how kind of disturbing that is. But yeah, he's immediately taken by her and wants her to join him, and she's like, okay, because early on she's also described as just like being really sexual and like wanting to explore, and that's like you're talking about, like you can be perceived as sort of body positivity, sex positivity, but also how that's getting sort of manipulated by these men around her. And how you have to talk about this with children, right? It's her first forays into sexuality are sort of innocent and understandable. Because she's in the body of a woman and she's interacting with adult men, it becomes very complicated, to put it mildly.
Right. And so she goes off on this journey, has this sexual appetite that not even this guy can keep up with or whatever.
Right.
And so she's like, it's not just about the sexuality too. She's like, he's exhausted. He's staying on the ship. I think they're on like sort of a cruise, and they got off at locations, and she goes and explores the city and has all these fascinating new discoveries, and is really like, in essence, discovering herself as like people tend to do. They find themselves at certain teenage to young adulthood kind of age. And
this mirrors a little bit of the monster's journey in Frankenstein, when he goes off, of course, and lives with other families and explores the world and becomes highly educated. I thought that there were some similarities in their stories here. Her rapid maturation seems to continue, and she becomes like a brilliant doctor, and as we move along. But I was also really interested by jealousy in this book, and how, if one thing could be said for McCandless that I found redeemable about him, that maybe didn't just hate him, is that at the very least he has like moments of jealousy, but then he quickly moves past them, as he sort of genuinely seems to be impressed with her, at least later on, as she starts to demonstrate her own autonomy, and she's sending these letters where she's exploring the world and exploring all these different relationships, and becoming this like formidable person in conversations, because she like recounts entire passages of conversations she's having. And I think he like This is where he like seems to actually fall in love with her as a person, versus I would argue early on where maybe it's a bit more of the sexual object than anything else. But by the time she returns, it seems like he has actually fallen in love with her through these letters. At least that was my interpretation of it.
Yeah. And just to check back in on the layers here, I think this is a good time to note that we're talking about Gray as the author.
Yeah.
Is then editing this piece written by another author who's McCandless. McCandless is writing in the story the letters that
she supposedly wrote.
Yeah, she supposedly wrote. So all of these layers of possible misinformation and misinterpretation and all of that is there. And so non-reliable is taken to like the next level all across the board in this story. So even the stories that Bella is telling in her letters back could be possible fabrications or changed in some ways. So just, I don't know, really interesting to think about that as we go along.
That represents like a big part of the book where she's left the whole time. What's your take on Godwin? Because he's an interesting figure at first who seems very guarded of her, seems very protective of her. According to McCandless, it seems because it's like he wishes that she would be his companion. But then he quickly likes the idea of her being with McCandless, especially over Wedderburn, who he really disapproves of. He does have this like funny affect to him, and he's a very oddball guy. And every time he offered him this like weird vegetable gruel that he drinks made me laugh. There was definitely an element of humor there that persisted throughout that I did enjoy.
Yeah, they talk a couple times about like McCandless and Baxter having dinner together, and McCandless has to sit like as far away on the table as he can because while he's eating or drinking, he's also ingesting some sort of like foul smelling liquids and things like that
or maybe emitting an odor. It was implied, yeah. Because again, like it's kind of implied that maybe he himself is a surgical, creation.
I do think there's some significant weight to that. I think that's possible.
Yeah.
Eventually they end up at this brothel, and I think this does a lot.
When you say they, Bella and Wedderburn and some of the men she's met along the way wind up at this brothel.
Really interesting sort of moment where she puts the pieces together, I think, with a lot of like the sexuality, and then she's also had these conversations about politics and religion and I thought all of that was really rich. And honestly, that's what this book is, right? It's very rich in terms of like all the layers that you're getting and the thought-provoking moments that are there. And again, this story is designed to make you think about think down different paths that you possibly haven't before.
Well, if we unpack that a little bit, right, when we see her as younger in her mind, right, and she's talking to these men who at first are sort of treating her as if she is, completely immature, and they're like introducing these ideas to her, like, let me explain these ideas to you, right? And I love that when she's younger and less knowledgeable about the world, the certain ideas appeal to her, right? The idea that the world is great as is, the idea that like England is this or Anglo-Saxons in particular are these like superior race whose like job it is to go around the world and introduce them to the better way of life. And when she's this like younger maturation in her mind, she's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I like that. This is all great. But as she starts to becoming more and more exposed to the world, and she sees how much people are suffering, and she sees the effect that the colonialism has had around the world, she immediately flips, right? Or she starts to flip, and she becomes much more interested in socialism and anarchism and different things like that. And I love that it's like as she matures, so do her politics in that direction. I think is a very specific message that Alasdair Gray is putting on here, right? It's like, when you were a child, you might have thought these one things, but maybe as an adult, you should think differently about it.
Well, and the commentary is made there too that like, I think inherently prejudices are you're not born with those. That's something society puts on you. And so like the early on,
they're appealing to a mind that isn't going to think deeply about them.
Right. So early on, Bella is like, I didn't think anything. I thought everyone was kind of on the same page, and I thought we were all the same here, and everyone's my brothers and sisters kind of thing. We're all family. And then they're like imposing all these beliefs and all this other stuff on her, and she's like, and it's funny, like I said before, when in talking about religion and some of these other things, she keeps saying like God, my God, and she's talking about Godwin, in a lot of ways, which just continues to be really funny. And she calls Candless Candle.
My candle, yeah. She's his bell, and he's my candle, yeah.
Yeah, there's many moments that are very funny in these otherwise like very serious conversations. And yeah, so kind of imposing all that on this young mind, and then seeing a rational person with good morals sort of navigate that and make their own decision and find what the difference between right and wrong without somebody explicitly telling them. I thought,
and in fact, they're telling her the wrong, like often the wrong things, and they're doing a great job of explaining them in ways, right? Like they're very persuasive. And I constantly was like, oh no, how much is she going to believe this, what he's saying, because he's saying it in a very persuasive way. And I love that this was almost set up as like a way for Alasdair Gray to explore these questions and to find at the core of them, like what might be some faults in them. And she starts poking at them and saying, oh, what about this thing? And like a lot of that stuff, I think, is kind of the heart of the book. And at the time, I didn't realize how important it was to the message of the book, but I think it is sort of essential.
Yeah.
So a lot of that stuff, which is told multi layers down, right? Like we're deep in the, we're deep in the dream here, and multi layers deep.
We're incepted, like 5 layers deep.
Yeah. And who knows how true any of this is, right? Of course, it's all fiction, but like even within the truth of the narrative, how true any of this is. So the brothel, I do think that's really important because finally she gets the influence of a woman. Now she's had one before, and she's throughout mentioned as having sort of what they call sapphic relationships. So she's clearly got she's at least bisexual or, open to sex with anybody. And she has these different relationships, but those were so frowned upon for the time and not viewed as serious. So it's not something that she pursues. But she had this relationship with like a tutor or something at one point that doesn't work out. But then now she finally gets like another perspective from a woman who is like the madam of a brothel and has a very worldly sort of understanding of how men are and how the world is, and imparts a lot of that knowledge onto her after she's had all this, stuff from all these different men. She gets that perspective. I think that finally rounds her out in a way and gives her some perspective on her particular gender and the way that society views women, which is like finally the much needed context I think she needs. And it also provides some context for her for like sex and how men view sex and how women have can use sexuality, right? And she also for what that time works as a prostitute, so she sees that there is even a way to like the way that like currency is exchanged for sex in this scenario. I think finally shows her something about sex that she, I think up to this point, didn't really understand.
Yeah, I think that you could argue that that's what people go through in growing up, and specifically women, in learning like early on, there's urges and desires and things like that. And then, like you said, the sort of baggage that comes with it when more experienced people come along and just as you develop as a person. But she's so strong on her own at this point. Now she has all the information, she has all the context, like you said, and she's so formidable because she's like explored the world, she's heard all these philosophies, she's really become into her own. And then now she's become intimidating to all the men in this story, which early on it was all about like the men preying on her. And then like we get a little bit of her sort of like,
now they represent she represents like a challenge intellectually to them,
and a threat, almost
what all the men didn't want, right? That they wanted the child who wasn't an intellectual threat, who was going to challenge them
in a Victorian era too. Like this isn't the 90s, this is like, so it's very like modern in that sense. And kind of poking at some of the things that went on.
I did love to see the sort of pride it seemed like Baxter was taking in it though, right? Like even as he was trying to treat things delicately because he knew that McCandless was in love with her, and so he was trying not to provoke jealousy as much as he maybe could, but it seemed like there was also a budding pride on his part as he was really admiring the woman she was becoming through the course of these letters. That was interesting to see. It makes me like Baxter a little bit more. Like, and ultimately, I did find that he was a sort of a tragic figure that I did like. And even as McCandless is also kind of a tragic figure that I found my way to having affection for. To really, I thought I was going to heavily dislike both of these guys.
Yeah, I would say for me, the waters are still muddy there. Like their intentions and the setup, their intentions early on paint them as sort of like what their baser instincts or what what they actually think, especially with Baxter being the one to create, because that's sort of the Victor Frankenstein, like the unnatural nature of getting into some of these sciences and creating something like this against
their will.
Although
if he himself is a monster created by his, the surgeon that was his father, then it becomes more understandable that he would reach to this as a way to create a companion for himself, right? Like it's hard to blame the monster for creating the Bride of Frankenstein, right?
A little bit, yeah.
I don't know.
I think McCandless having all the information along the way too, and agreeing to a engagement that early. I guess you could say there were like
they become
engaged
when, that's
there have
true.
always been arranged marriages that kind of are like maybe age-wise don't match up well, and maybe you could say like in the Victorian era there's something like that. But for me, I was like, he has all the information and he's weird about it the whole way through, and he kind of develops into actually loving her for the person she is. But at the same time, gray character for me.
Of course, this is also his account of what happened, which is highly doubtful. But one of the things I will say about him is that, like he knows her mind is like maybe early teens. And I think that's the point in which they become engaged. And he proposes to her is like his ultimate love. So he knows. And he casts it as like, he's like, well, she needs to be with someone like me. Like, it's like clearly all these other men are like trying to not steal her away, but like she's going to be in a much worse situation with all these other men, so it's better it's me. Seems like it's sort of justified to himself a little bit, but also he's just smitten with her. And sometimes it doesn't even seem like he analyzes that for himself. Like, why do I like her so much? Like, and that never comes out. He never talks about that, right? He just does.
I actually thought it was kind of strange. Again, because this is possibly all fictionalized, that we're going to learn here in a minute. I thought it was very interesting
within the narrative,
right, within the narrative. I thought it was interesting that like in the end they end up together. I was kind of like analyzing that, and I was like, okay, what's the intention of the author here if they do end up together after all of this? And then,
but we got to talk about the last. We'll get to the last bit, but before we get there, let's focus on this final scene, which I think is going to be a really huge moment in the movie. I assume so. It's worth talking about here. It's the sort of climax of this main narrative. That's when she comes back. They go to have their wedding, and then at the wedding shows up her former husband and her father from when she was Victoria, before she was Bella Baxter. And they're there to say, hey, you can't get married because you're married to me, this general. And that sets up this confrontation almost that happens back at Baxter's home, where he has them all over and they sit down to talk about it. And we get the story about Victoria and her life and Victoria Blessington, and like talking about layers, right? It's told to us from the men who are at the heart of it, who are the most likely villains in her life, right? Her father, who refused to help her at her most desperate time because he found like pregnancy icky, was like one of the main reasons he gave. He was like, oh, she was really pregnant, I didn't want her to be around. And she had like come to him in desperation, right? And she was so depressed and driven away from this man, this general, who we learn is like not a good dude, was like kind of a war criminal. And he is the one who is recounting to us about like her life and how, oh yeah, she totally loved me, and this is what she was. She was sex obsessed. That was her main problem. And yet he was like having affairs on the side with like servants, or abusing servants. So it's all unreliable, right? Like nothing they're saying can be taken on face value, and yet we are learning about her between the lines. And that's some of the like cleverest writing to me. I really loved that. How we're learning about the woman that she actually was by understanding that these guys are lying, or they're at least like distorting the truth, right? To try and tell a version of it that makes them look good. And I love that our characters are clever enough to see through it, because all of them, to some extent, like there's like they're giving looks to each other, McCandless and Baxter, where they're like, this is not true. Like clearly this man's lying. And then Bella, of course, throughout. She's eating it up. She's learning about her former self, but I think she is so smart at this point. She recognizes that, okay, none of what he's actually, like the surface level of what he's saying is not true, even if some of the facts may be true.
I mean, and so another thing that had just happened previous to this is when she gets back, she asks where her baby is to
Oh
Baxter
yeah.
and McCandless, and like she kind of figured they don't tell her, and she figures kind of puts it all together. So she's like realizing she doesn't have a past. She's realizing like she's kind of her own daughter in a sense. And
Okay, so I wasn't clear that she actually understood that at this point.
I think I mean, I think it's implied that she's figured out that
At the
like
very least, she
they're not telling her.
knows she was sort of resurrected by Godwin.
Yeah.
And that she has amnesia about her life before, and then she thinks her baby just died when she died. I wasn't clear that she understood that her brain was like her baby's brain, and that she is her own daughter in that really fucking weird sense, which is a mind fuck. And I was kind of, I wanted a scene where we got that. That was one of the things that I would say I thought was kind of missing, because she's brilliant at this point in the story, and throughout to an extent, but like at this point she's developed into this like brilliant woman, and I wanted to know how she would feel about that reveal. And right. I got, maybe you can interpret that she was guessing at it, but she never like said like, that's who I am, this is how I feel about it, and maybe that's just too big of a question to have her grapple with. And I don't know. And we get some sense of it in the final letters. But it's dismissive, and we'll get to why. But you can maybe read between the lines, because a lot of this book is about that, like, what is actually happening behind what is being said, right? And what's the motivations of the person writing it,
right?
And for that example, McCandless here throughout is trying to make himself look good, so he does come off as somewhat sympathetic, but he's the one writing the book about himself. So
she's surpassed, I think, everyone else in the story as far as like autonomy and what she's like, the way she impacts what goes on. So like this guy is like, come back with us, and there's all these debates that go on as far as like there's lawyers and people involved and who's in the right and who can have her basically.
Yeah, and exactly. Then, she's a possession at this point. They're trying to determine who owns her.
And eventually she's like, I'm going to make the decision. She kind of makes the decision. She's like, I'm staying here. I don't want to live in, I think she even calls life with that general a prison or something like that.
Yeah.
And so she makes the decision to stay there with Baxter and marry McCandless. And then this General Blessington pulls a gun and holds everybody up, and then ends up shooting her in the foot, because she kind of like stands up and runs in.
She like grabs the gun from him, and it like goes off or something in the process of her taking it from
him. And then only
yeah.
then do all the men kind of react, right? Like she's again the first person to take action here and like take. So we've seen this character develop from like seemingly a child to now taking full control of the narrative. And again, it's all up to the interpretation of what McCandless is writing, but I thought cool to see that she stood up for herself in this narrative, and then also kind of made her own decisions whether I feel like she should be with McCandless or not. That's I guess not my place to say, but I just felt like it was weird even at the end that they ended up together. But
well, yeah, but we'll talk about the final letter. So yeah, this big reveal. She takes the gun, she fires the rest of the shots into the fireplace. But really the big moment is when she reveals that she knows something about this general, that he is actually this infamous customer of the brothel in which she worked at, where he would come in and like get into the most like depraved things, right? And he, at the very least, would be very embarrassed to have these details become public. And her knowledge about his intimate, proclivities, is enough, I think, to make him back off. And that's ultimately how she's able to get him to leave her alone and to allow this to happen. Because yeah, he seems like he's a pretty awful dude. It seems like he is abusing, his servants, and was clearly a terrible husband. So, yeah, she ends up sort of winning there and getting her own way. But that sort of winds up being the end of this nested narrative. And then we get a bunch of this errata afterwards, where it's a lot of like clarifying facts, talking about things that are definitely true. And like, here's what, we hear about the fates of each character. I guess we should say that. Supposedly Blessington shoots himself, off in his home. Godwin eventually succumbs to like this illness that he's had for a long time.
Yep.
McCandless and Victoria are seemingly happily married, have several children. She becomes this a really accomplished doctor. He himself is also like this health officer, according to him, and like he had this like, you know, fairly productive life, but it was kind of like outshined by his amazing wife who did all these things. And then he ends up dying. And then after he dies, we get this final account from Victoria herself, where she has written this letter where she is reacting to this book.
This is the 70s narrative. This is like it's supposed to be like the last living relative of Victoria, and it's like, I think, grandchildren.
Yeah, she's writing it to her grandchildren or something. Yeah. That's right.
So this is her account of like, these are all the, you know, this book got popular, it's out there, people know the story, but I want to like go in and say like, you know, some of this is bullshit and tell my side of the story.
Yeah, she basically says it's all bullshit. She's like, I wasn't, you know, the brain of a fetus implanted, like that, none of that's true. And she has this like account of her life growing up that is drastically different. She talks about how she did have a relationship with Baxter, and how she actually was in love with him, and he wasn't that ugly, and that was all made up by McCandless. And then she is like, talking about her relationship with McCandless, this completely recasts it, because she's very dismissive of him, and like she's like, yeah, he's kind of an idiot. He was fine, but I don't know why he was so obsessed with this book and why he decided to write it. You know, he was maybe jealous of me. And it seems like at this point, if you start to read between the lines, what did you think the purpose was of her writing this account? Because to me, there was like, I think there is truth to this. I think there is like this is what really happened in the narrative, but she's calling it all lies for a reason. What do you think?
So multiple things. I think one, I don't think you can come down either way on quite a lot of these things. I'm interested to hear, but I think that it could, because I think it exists in a space where like both things are kind of true. Yeah. And I'll get into why, because I want to give the perspective of a reader here. Like this first section, why would we've been talking about unreliable narrators, and like that's kind of the stuff that we're bringing in, knowing how the ending goes. When you're reading the story initially, you're gonna believe the narrator, because that's typically.
Although he does say like there are skeptics who won't believe this. Like that's one of the things he keeps talking about. And he's like, here's my proof as to why.
Then we get into something that feels a lot closer to the real world and doesn't have these supernatural elements to it. And we have someone who is there's facts that are given, right? And there's facts in the original story that maybe some of that holds some truth. But then we move into this, and it's like 1970s, you know, telling it to her grandkids. Why would she lie in a lot of these things? She was a successful doctor. All of this like legitimizes this character. And so we're like, okay, like let's believe this character then. Like this is clearly her kind of trying to say like, this is all fake. This is actually what happened. Or you can read it as she's trying to cover up the fact that she is some sort of creation, and she doesn't want there to be like something like that on her legacy, like basically where people will look back and think like, oh, that's weird and unnatural and that kind of thing.
Well, and also the controversy around the fact that she knows like no one's going to believe it anyway, so it's better if they just don't believe it.
Right, kind of trying to like shroud some of the mystery there, like cover it all back up in the ancient past. But I do want to say we get this third element in the story that's like Alasdair Gray giving all these like historical edits and all these papers and everything that he's like compiling and giving notes on a lot of the story. I noticed that there were some things that contradicted what she was saying in her version of the events as well.
Yeah, I think he's kind of pointing us towards it maybe being actually true. But it's the truth is unknowable even within the narrative, because like you said, how unreliable McCandless is. So I came down on it to where like I think Alasdair Gray is implying that these events happened within the narrative. They were misrepresented by McCandless in a way to make him look better, but a lot of that is fairly accurate. Victoria at the end, to me, is trying to she because we know Bella Baxter wanted to change the world, and when she got married to McCandless, that was her like goal, is like, we are going to change the world for the better together. And then that became her life through the things she did as a doctor, but also politically. She was like constantly lobbying. She was this like well-known socialist, and she was trying to change the world for the better. And then she, even at the end of her life, there's like this big political win, and she's like, this is going to change everything. Glasgow is going to be on the right, on the right path now. Scotland's on the right path now, and I'm not going to believe anybody who says otherwise because I want to die happy.
Well, and I think she's like a well-known like suffragette, like women's rights, like sort of like feminist in that community as well.
And at this point, her husband has died, and she now is in another sapphic relationship, which I thought was interesting. How once again it comes back to that, and she. She lives alone with all her dogs, which was also an interesting echo of like Baxter. She seems kind of like Baxter like at this point. She's this, renowned surgeon who lives with all of her animals. But again, I think she is trying to unmuddy the waters when it comes to her legacy, because what she ultimately cares about is what she does later in life, like her later works, her role as a doctor and as a political figure. And she doesn't want that to be tarnished by what may have been her origin. So she's distancing herself from all of it, calling it all lies. And I like that, because that underlines that ultimately for her, none of that's important compared to like what I did later in life and what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
And so that to me is the motivation behind those final letters. Even as like, yes, maybe there is some inaccuracies that she's rightfully pointing out, but maybe there's some other things that are true that she's calling inaccuracies. Because everybody in this story is lying to some extent at all times.
Exactly. So you can be forgiven for interpreting it however you want.
That was my interpretation.
I kind of line up with what you're saying as far as like, I want to believe that some of this stuff happened, but there's then a part of me that also doesn't want to believe some of the kind of disgusting stuff that went on, like how she was treated and that kind of thing.
Well,
but
it also helps with like the idea that like this was all written by a man, and like maybe some of this stuff is from a male perspective.
Sure, male gaze, voyeuristic kind of look at it.
It gets away. It puts that onto McCandless. It's like, no, that's not Alasdair Gray. That's how McCandless was interpreting it, because he was, this fucked up guy.
Right.
So he kind of like is creating like a distance between himself and that potential criticism.
In kind of a brilliant way too, like to kind of walk the razor's edge of telling this kind of story and obviously giving it the social weight that it deserves in really cool ways. But I also love in her kind of takedown of McCandless's recounting of the events. She like, I think she mentions Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, right?
Yeah, she's like, oh, this is clearly drawn by Mary Shelley and Edgar Allan Poe. He was reading a lot of that at the time, so it's a very sordid tale. Yeah.
So that that's one of those scenarios where it's like that's an easy way to cover that stuff up. And
Alasdair Gray was a big fan of Poe, by the way.
I can see that.
I love it when all these little connections happen with the past things we've covered. So. Yeah, I thought this was brilliant and ultimately highly interpretive, very confusing and weird, but also like really cool. I love that it ended up being kind of a political manifesto in a way, and how the sort of radical left-wing politics of Alasdair Gray made it into this book, and it's really, in a really interesting way, is sort of analyzes what it means to be a good person, and what it means, like what kind of person you can even be. Really cool stuff. Like we could quote all sorts of it now, but we don't want to get too deep into it. Here at the end, though, if you're okay to speculate, I want to hear your thoughts on a potential film adaptation of this book, because what a fucking wild book to try and put on screen. You can't, it seems to me, have so much unreliableness. Like I always feel like the camera is going to show something that we're supposed to perceive as true.
I think, in my estimation, what I would assume they would do is strip back some of these layers, just a few of them, right? The Alasdair Gray layer probably goes as far as an adaptation goes. And then
are there any layers to it? Are we just presented with the core narrative?
I do think so. I think we do get some sort of like post story sort of like final epigraph kind of thing. I don't know what you would even call that.
So you think like they are going to find some like papers or something, and like this is an account that we're now reading, and
yeah, I think something like that.
You could do that.
Some just like older version of Emma Stone's character, like Victoria, Bella, kind of saying like, oh yeah, disputing some of the claims and everything like that when she is very successful. But in adapting this, there's so much. Again, this is such like sort of like this material is so difficult to kind of approach, and you have to handle it really well. But I'm hearing nothing but great things from Yorgos Lanthimos's adaptation, and I think talking about unreliable narrators and how it's difficult to depict that with the camera, I do think that you show multiple version of events, like you show the same scene maybe from a couple different perspectives, and that's going to imply like some level of
Well, one of the other things you can do that occurs to me, and honestly, Alasdair Gray does it a little bit here, and we didn't talk about. At times, he pushes the bounds of what could be real. like there's this scream that Baxter emits that is said to have been heard like all over the city.
Yeah.
And it's described as like a gaping hole that like almost like takes over his entire head as he's screaming. It's described in a surrealist way. If the film does a lot of surrealism in that sense and like pushes the bounds of like what could even be possible in the real world, that will push it into an area of like, is this true? Right?
Yeah, totally.
So that could be cool. I don't know much about this filmmaker, by the way. What other movies has he made that you have seen? I'm just curious. Like
The Lobster he directed, which was really popular. I don't know, maybe close to 10 years ago. He did Dogtooth.
I remember hearing about that one.
Dogtooth was huge. Somewhat recently, he did The Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Heard of that one. Okay. Haven't seen any of these.
He's an excellent filmmaker. Like legitimately, since basically The Lobster, he's been in my top tier of working filmmakers.
So the thing I'm probably most excited about is that it seems to me like this is going to be a much more focused story on Bella.
Yeah.
And we might get more of that sense of like how she feels about herself. And it's going to take the story, I think, and give it to her in a way that you could consider it kind of just partially hers in this book.
I agree with you. I think we'll see some adjusting. I don't think it's going to be like one for one because it'd be very difficult to pull off. And I think that there's some interpretation needed, maybe some adjusting. Like I said, I've heard nothing but good things. And speaking, another one that people loved that was actually nominated as well from Yorgos Lanthimos was The Favorite, which also had Emma Stone. So they're collaborating again in this one. So I'm just so excited. I had to really restrain myself from going to see this before we covered it for the podcast. So I'm so excited.
Well, I am beyond excited now that I've read this, man. Like, I am so interested to see what is done here. So if you want to hear our take on the film, that'll be next week. So make sure to join us for that. If you enjoyed this episode and you enjoyed our coverage of Poor Things, let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you're listening on. And if you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and leave us a comment. It helps with the algorithm. But also, we like to read them and we like to engage with people and let us know your thoughts on this book. And maybe if you've only seen the movie and you hadn't read this book, like how does this strike you? I'm really curious to hear from people.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film. We're also on TikTok and YouTube Shorts and all the other stuff. So make sure you find us wherever you can.
Blue Sky. Also, if you would like to support this podcast in another way, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm. And on there, you get tons of bonus content, including, alternate adaptations that we've covered for like our mainline ones on the feed. So it's a great way to support us financially and helps us keep this thing going.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right. That's going to be it for this week. So until next time,
keep adapting.